chapter 11, can you explain to the class what is meant by the tragedy of the commons? A commons is in old New England. It was a place in New York. It was a commonly owned area in which people would put their cows. All right? Can you now come up with what the tragedy of the commons is? What might it mean today? For example, if we deforest, what is the consequence of deforestation, for example?
Less shade over top of river valleys.
Maybe so, and what else? What about the atmosphere?
Increasing CO2.
Increasing CO2. The trees are made of CO2. You're increasing the carbon dioxide of the atmosphere, and it's always advantageous to the person who cuts that next plot of land, right? And burns the trees and turns the carbon stored on the ground to carbon in the air. It's to that person's advantage to be able to have more land, even though, quite possibly, and we'll talk about this a lot more, it could be disastrous to everybody in the world. But it's still to that person's benefit, right?
Right.
Likewise, it might be to your benefit to use a little bit more oil or a little bit more coal or a little bit more whatever, and you could make some profit from it. You could increase your own fitness, perhaps, by being able to afford more children. But the net effect on all the people in the world might be negative. This is the tragedy of the commons. Who can tell me from their reading of chapter 10 what industrial metabolism is? Can you explain for me what metabolism is? The use of energy. Are you metabolizing right now?
Yes.
You bet. And what are you using that energy to do?
Talking.
Talking is a small part of it. What are you mostly doing?
Maintenance.
Maintenance metabolism. What's that mean? Holly, right?
Yes.
Holly, what's that mean?
Well, it's the energy used to maintain the cellular integrity.
Oh, very good. Energy used to maintain your cellular integrity, okay? Look at yourself in the mirror. You're put together. Your self is a wonderful, wonderful structure, very non-random. Takes a lot of energy to maintain that. And that's what you're doing right now. That's what Holly's doing right now. That's what I'm doing right now. Okay, we're using our energy from past meals to maintain our cellular metabolism, and then when you're walking around, when you're reading, when you're speaking, whatever you're doing, all of those require energy, and those are things that you're doing, okay? What's industrial metabolism?
It's like that.
If organismal metabolism is the energy that Holly is using right here, and you can, whew, cold hands, the arm is warm. Why is it warm? It's because she's oxidizing her Cheerios and using that to maintain this wonderful thing that's Holly. So, what's industrial metabolism? From the back row, yes sir. It's the energy to maintain and build. I mean, you guys up here, Josh, you had a little bit of it, but if it's industrial metabolism, Josh, they're talking about the industrial society that we live in. Okay? That's industrial metabolism. Good. What's your name? Kurt. Good, Kurt. So, it's the same idea. If we are to maintain the integrity of a person, or this room, or the city of Syracuse, or the city of New York City, or the industrial processes of Elizabeth, New Jersey, all of these require a continual investment of energy to maintain them and, as you said, to expand them under certain circumstances, which we call growth. So, this leads us into a discussion of what today's lecture is all about. We are going to work up to, is that ready? We're going to work up to the Industrial Revolution. We are going to ask, why are we here doing what we are doing here instead of doing what my father did when he was a kid, which was every day carry cow flocks from the barn out into the field, as his father and his father and his father had done for maybe an indefinite number of years. Something happened in about 1400, more or less, in Italy that completely changed what happened to human history, especially as it relates to people in this room. Now, I have to say that there were tremendously sophisticated, large and powerful civilizations in other parts of the world. Let me just list a few. We showed you a picture of ancient Ur. We didn't talk much about Egypt, but Egypt had a very, very sophisticated, very high degree of art and culture and so forth, and very powerful rulers at the top and very poor people at the bottom, culture for many, many years. And we haven't talked about Egypt, but it was very important. There were other very large empires in Africa that I'm afraid I don't know very much about. I know something about Egypt for sure, which was, of course, in Africa. There were very large cultures in Central America. When the Spaniards came to Mexico City, they saw before them a city probably 10 times larger and grander than anything that existed in Europe at that time. There were enormous cultures and very sophisticated cultures in China and India at this time. But Europe was basically a backwater. In Europe, people were farming, fighting, raising some animals. Cities were small. People often starved. And there was constant warfare. Then something happened. And probably that something goes back to somebody called St. Augustine. How many of you went to parochial schools? Read about St. Augustine? What did you read about St. Augustine? He spent his whole life horny as a tree toad and was horrified and was constantly writing down how sorry he was to God that he could never maintain his vows of chastity. Why should he? I don't know, but that was... And that's, if you read the Confessions of St. Augustine, as I did as a freshman, that's what it's all about. And eventually he renounced all of these sins of the flesh and became a man of God. By that time, maybe he was worn out, I don't know. But he did something else that we don't hear about very much. He made a distinction between usury, which is the time value, which is usury, which is money lending. Remember, money lending is disallowed in the Bible. You can't do it. And so the only people who could lend money in early Europe were people of the Jewish faith. And because of that, of course, well, it led to many conflicts in the past. You read about it in The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare. Or you can read a little bit of history. But basically, there was no concept of investment. Now, what St. Augustine said, he said, let's rework the Bible a little bit and make a distinction between usury, which is excessive interest, which is wrong, which is sinful, and interest, which is okay. Now, the distinction is kind of lost on me, but he was able to say it in sufficient terms that the religious power structure, which basically the power structure in Europe at that time was very much determined by the religious structure. What it did all of a sudden was to allow people to invest. So you could borrow money from Christians as well as from Jews, and bingo, something happened in Europe. And we call it now the Renaissance. People emerged from the Dark Ages and constructed all kinds of incredible cities, incredible cultures, incredible painting and art and music. All aspects of life became much more interesting, I would say, and people became personally much wealthier. Now, the focal point of this was in Tuscany in Florence, what we now call Florence or Firenze if you're in Italy, and there was a very powerful and important family, the Medici, M-E-D-I-C-I, who were incredible patrons of the arts and were very important bankers, but most importantly, they brought in the concept of investment. And what that meant was a person, instead of doing the same thing for his or her entire life, had the opportunity to invest in a boat or a piece of land or some kind of construction equipment or whatever, and look forward to generating a lot of personal money from their own work and from hiring others to do work. So this changed Europe from the Dark Ages to what we now call the Renaissance, and it pretty much took place in Italy. And so the important thing was, all of a sudden, St. Augustine said, you can do it. Now, did he have the ear of God to do this? I don't know. But that's the important thing, was that we emerged from the structure of the church, which was very interested in keeping things the way it was. Another very important thing that took place at this time was in Germany, which was the invention of the printing press. The printing press allowed ideas, often technical ideas, to be spread from one place to another. For ideas to be spread before that, it had to take place by one person going to the next city, maybe training some people at that city, going to the next city. But with the invention of, technically, the movable type printing press, books became, for the first time, not simply the property of the very wealthy, but the property of average people, middle class we would call them, entrepreneurs, some of them, and they could get ideas about how to make metal, about how to grow plants, how to build ships. All of these were able to spread much more quickly throughout Europe, and this gave them a tremendous advantage. But the ideas of the Renaissance were useless without increasing the amount of energy available to make investments meaningful. And so when we look at how at the time of Medici most work was done, it was done, we saw another picture of this. Here are some miners, and water is collecting in the bottom of their mine. And you see that this is a cross piece on an axle, and this guy's turning a crank, and these guys are turning the cross piece sticks. And there's a bucket of water they're taking out of the mine. So you can see that one human's effort was very small. What one person could do was very, very little, the work that they could do. And so just the mining of whatever they're mining, probably some metal, was greatly restricted by the quite restricted power available from humans. With the allowance of investments, people began to construct machines that could harness other sorts of energy. Now, remember, these ideas had been around for a long, long time. Even the Greeks knew about windmills and so forth. But a single person could not build such a large device as this windmill. The Netherlands was one particular place they were constructed, without having investment capital, without being able to hire 10 or 20 people to help construct this large machine. Once you had this machine constructed, then you could use the power of the wind to greatly increase the power of your muscles. So if you were grinding grain, for example, taking corn and grinding it into flour, you could do a lot more work in an hour or a day or a lifetime with this machine supplementing your muscles. So we call this general concept an energy subsidy. Your own energy is in this case being subsidized by environmental energies, and that's allowing you to greatly increase what you can produce in an hour. Those of you who've had any economics, value added is how much you increase the value of whatever you're working on, flour versus what you started with, which is corn, in an hour. So the value added, the wealth produced per worker enormously increased over time. And this was the true beginning of the ascendancy, in some respects, or at least coming out of the Dark Ages, of the Europeans and of enhancing their own wealth. For people at that time, almost all of their life went into simply producing the food that they ate. All of a sudden, people could have some surplus, meaning that they could build a better house to live in, that they could contribute to art, to entertainment, to streets, paved streets, all kinds of things that we consider the marks of civilization. And paved streets, for example, is incredibly important. If you ever spend much time in an environment where the streets are not paved, life is not very pleasant. But you have to have some surplus energy in order to hire somebody to go and cut stones to put them down and make what we would call today paved streets. Now we don't even think about it. We do it with tar. It's really trivial. It's easy. I was riding around here with some friends from Argentina a while ago when we finally went fishing down in the Catskills, and they were amazed when we went onto a dirt road. And they say, you know, Argentina is a very highly developed, highly industrialized country, but they said, you know, we've been here for a month. It's the first time we've been on a road that hasn't been paved. Whereas most of the roads we'd be on in Argentina would be not paved. So things we take for granted were very important when they first became part of the cityscapes. Now, at the same time, people began to greatly enhance the ability and power of exploiting water power. Now, here is a river. This is the easy one to build. You just stick this paddle wheel into a river that's going by, and the river turns the wheel. It's got gears made out of wood. These are very inefficient. You get a very high loss of the energy to friction, to heat, but you got a sufficient river flowing by, and you can produce quite a bit of energy that you can do many things with. Incidentally, one of the things that people did with this energy was combine their knowledge of metallurgy with the power they'd get from water power and forged cannons. Speaking of kleptocracy, and then go steal wealth from somebody else. Well, that's what they did. But the important thing that really happened was the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution, we're going to talk for a little while, took place principally in England and secondarily in Germany. And what we have here is a lady working at a spinning plant making cloth. In the past, the cloth would be made at home with a spinning wheel. So a woman would work at home with and it was mostly women, with wool or cotton. And they'd spend their whole life taking wool or cotton balls and turning it into thread, and then using that thread to weave clothes, what we would call now homespun clothes. And you didn't make very many clothes in a year working that way. It was a very labor-intensive way. I don't know, maybe the people who did it were perfectly happy. They could be at home with their their domestic situation and with their children, and perhaps they were very happy. What happened with the Industrial Revolution, with the sources of energy moved from the household, meaning her foot power to run the spinning wheel, to these big industrial looms that were powered by either water power normally or by wind power, and as you'll see increasingly by coal, then the people moved out of their houses, out of their parents' houses, and into often cities. And in these cities, well, you read all kinds of Victorian novels about this, the Dickens novels and so forth. People were often treated to horrible, horrible conditions, were paid very, very little in this kind of work, and it was very repetitive, but it greatly enhanced the amount of cloth and the amount of clothes that a person could make in that amount of time. And what it did was basically increase enormously the wealth of society, because each person would make more products in a given time, in a day or a year. The Industrial Revolution required two things. The first thing is it required some ideas. And these ideas came from four great English economists. The first is Adam Smith. These are called the classical economists. And Adam Smith wrote about the wealth of nations. And he looked for the sources of wealth, and something that's often misrepresented even here, it is said that Adam Smith was a great promoter of free enterprise, of no government or certainly no guild restrictions on trade. Anybody could do anything they wanted. Because of the availability of investment money, people could go and borrow money from a bank and build their own business. And Adam Smith thought that was pretty good. If you read his later books, though, he thought that unregulated competition was not as great as he had thought when he was younger. Now, a great important book, a second book came along that we've already seen was important to Charles Darwin. It's Malthus's essay on population, where Malthus said that the population will grow geometrically because of the nature of a constant number of children to a growing number of a growing base of people will lead, as Dr. Bartlett certainly talked about, to exponential growth. And Malthus thought that populations would grow exponentially and food production could only grow linearly. And he was greatly concerned about that. Now, of course, there were so many wars and famines and hard times in much of Europe that it didn't make much difference, that the population had a hard time catching up with food production, but that's another story. A third is David Ricardo, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. And Ricardo showed how wealth is distributed under such a question. So the question is not simply how much wealth is produced, but who gets it. And those are perhaps two fundamental questions of economics. How much wealth is produced, and who gets the cookies? Who gets the stuff? And we, of course, argue about it in our Congress virtually every day still. Ricardo, in my mind, is an extraordinarily interesting person. He was a Spanish Jew living in London who was incredibly influential, a member of Parliament. He was totally accepted into English society. He made vast fortunes with his investments. But more importantly, to me, he thought about all kinds of economic questions that remain critically important today, and we'll talk about a little bit later in this class. Reading Ricardo today is great. And then John Stuart Mill asked, again, a lot of questions about who gets the wealth and how do we consider it. But that was the intellectual ideas that one could say either led or or followed the critical issues of the Industrial Revolution. And what happens starts 400, 800 million years ago in the swamps of what is now Pennsylvania, Mississippi, and many other parts of the world, where we had ancient forests, very, very productive, high primary productivity, ancient forests that, due to some accidents of geology, the organic material was buried by sediments and sealed off from oxidation. If you walk around a New York forest today, you find lots of dead trees on the ground and you watch them decompose. You can see them in different stages of decomposition. Well, in the swamps that used to cover many areas, including Syracuse, New York, these were somehow, by anaerobic, meaning no oxygen conditions, in the bottom of these ecosystems accumulated as organic material and were covered up periodically by sediments of great floods. And this, over many hundreds of millions of years, is turned into coal. And coal is the basis of the Industrial Revolution. England had quite a bit of coal. Here's England here. And France, Belgium, and Germany also had large deposits of coal. But the English were the first really to exploit this. And the coal, all of a sudden, enormously increased the muscles of each worker. And we'll show you some examples. Next. Here is the first, one of the first engines called a Newcomen engine, named after Mr. Newcomen. And it was used to pump water out of the mines in England. Remember those guys that were turning the crank trying to pump the water up with buckets out of the mines? Oh, it's pretty hard to do. But then they started doing it with horses, and they didn't have enough horses in England to do it. And so this guy, Newcomen, came up with the idea of putting some coal here, heating the steam, and using the steam to move a giant piston. This thing was enormous. A person would be just like that. These were enormous things. And move this giant piston up and down, which would then lift an enormous bucket of water up and down and move the water out of the mine. And the English mines at that time, both coal mines and other iron mines and other mines, lead mines, were saved. Now, over time, this was a very, very inefficient engine. For those of you, any engineers here? No engineers? Why no engineers? Well, any of you are going to become an engineer. The reason it was inefficient was that they condensed the steam inside the boiler with a squirt of water. And then they had to cool the boiler down, and then they drained the water out, and then they had to heat it all up again for the next stroke. So along came James Watt, and he invented a new engine that automatically could go back and forth, and the motion of the piston itself would trigger the valves that would enter steam in and let it go out. So you'd be squirting in steam this way, and then squirting in steam this way, and you made a vastly more efficient and vastly more powerful engine. And it didn't take very long until this guy, Richard Trevithick, made the first railroad locomotive. And bingo, all of a sudden, transport was not limited by how fast a horse could walk. And then Cooper came along and made a larger and more powerful one, and it evolved over time till you get this kind of a steam engine that we have today. I guess you only see it now if you have electric trains, but when I was a kid, this was the kind of locomotives that were going back and forth. So, next. This was the first one we just saw was called a rocket because it could go 20 miles an hour. Things have changed. Now, let's just take a look at the power, the increase in power that these technical changes allowed over time. A person can produce about 100 watts. Each of you is, when working, is equal to about a 100-watt light bulb. When you're sitting there, it might be 40 or 50 watts. An ox can produce about, so that's 0.1 kilowatt. Kilo just means 1,000, I hope you know that. Ox, 0.2 kilowatts. A horse, which can go faster than an ox, 0.5 kilowatts. A windmill, 15. A water wheel, 300. A steam engine, 2,000. So a steam engine, even an old steam engine like that rocket, is 20,000 times more powerful than a person and can do 20,000 times more work, whatever that work is. Grinding grain or manufacturing something or drilling holes or moving produce over iron rails. And then you look at where we've gone today. Internal combustion engine is 10,000, gas turbine 80,000. That's like on a jet plane. A water turbine, a modern one, 100,000. Steam turbine, 1 million, and a liquid fuel rocket, 16 million kilowatts. Tremendous, tremendous increase in our ability to utilize energy. And what did we do with this energy? Well, we made a lot of iron tools, and this allowed us to exploit far, far more land area and increase the amount of agricultural production, which led to the ability of families to have more children, which led to more people. Albert Bartlett would be sitting here, yup, he'd say. Now let's take a look at the evolution of sailing ships. We showed you the old Portuguese kayaks, and now here's a Dutch trader, a galleon, and this kind of ship, which was meant to be a merchant ship, not as fast, but it was very wide and it could hold a lot of stuff. All right, that evolved into a clipper ship. Beautiful, beautiful ships built by a guy named Donald McKay. And they could go from New York to San Francisco in 90 days, which was considered extraordinary at the time. Then it didn't take long for them to take ships and add some coal to them, and there are all these little steamships going along. See the coal, all of them, a big one and a small one, all coal-fired. And then here's a coal-fired whaler, and then they could move when the wind wasn't blowing. They could go faster, and as you can see, as they're capturing this whale, it increased their ability to exploit nature. So the basic fundamental message of this course so far is that this process of humans through their technology, whether it's spear points or agricultural technology or industrial technology, are increasing enormously their ability to exploit the resources of the world and to become personally wealthy in the process. Is this good or bad? Well, it's both. Maybe it's good from the sense that we have the leisure, because we're wealthy here, to not do what my father did every day, which was to take cow turds from the barn out to the farm, but to sit here and get a university education, which my father did get it eventually. It means that we have enormous leisure, enormous wealth. And this has just continued in the United States. Let's take a look at the production of our gross national product, one imperfect measure of our material wealth in the United States. If you look at this growth of wealth over 100 years, from 1890 to 1990 approximately, and you plot on the same time scale the energy that was used during that time period, it doesn't take a PhD in statistics to see that there's some kind of correlation there. So the enormous wealth that you enjoy today is just the continual process, the continuing process of what we've been looking at up to date. So the question that we have is this good or bad? Well, in many ways it's very good. We're going to talk some more about what some of the not so good aspects of it. How long can it continue? And what will be the consequences on the environment of this into the future? Okay, see you Wednesday.